A guten Erev Shabbos. 11 weeks and change from now, we'll be sitting down to the Seder. Please God in good health, please God with friends, family, and or loved ones, celebrating the freedom of our people from slavery and reflecting, in other words, hopefully looking back, on the challenging times that we've gone through in the last couple of years because of the pandemic. It's certainly easier to look back on difficult times than to actually live through them, but we know that when we do make it through, it challenges us, strengthens us, and gives us more to tell the future generations. And when will it all end? That's a good question, and it's one we might ask at the Seder itself. It's not one of the 4 questions officially, but by now you know that you're allowed to ask all the questions you want at the Seder and leading up to the Seder. In fact, really, the whole year is a preparation for the Seder. So the week before, the month before, month leading up to the Pesach from Purim, and even now, as we're beginning to read Shemos, the book of Exodus, all good times to ask questions. This week, we read about how the sojourn in Egypt quickly turned into enslavement, and how Hashem sent us his faithful shepherd in the person of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Moses, to lead us out of there. Truth is, we mention the Exodus every single day of our lives in the Shema, evening and morning. So all the days of your life is both the nights and the days, according to one voice in the Haggadah, and all the days of our lives is now and in the Messianic times, according to another voice in the Haggadah. Let's look into this question of when it will end. In last week's portion of Vayechi, with which we concluded Bereshis, the book of Genesis, Yaakov was just about to reveal. He said he was going to relate to his children, the Bnei Yisrael, what was going to happen in the end of days. Rashi explains he wanted to tell them when the end of times would come. At that very moment, for any number of reasons, some we think we understand, some we probably don't yet, he changed the subject. And he blessed them, which is good, but he never quite got around to telling them how long exile would last. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Chisha v'saketz. God reckoned out or calculated the end of our captivity. We say in the Haggadah on the Seder night, the fuller passages right after the 4 sons, as we begin to address the 4 sons and the 4 questions. Baruch Shomer Havtachasei Yisrael. We say, blessed is the one who keeps his promise to Israel, blessed be he. For God calculated the end in order to fulfill what he had said to our ancestor Abraham in the covenant of the parts, as it says, and this is a few parshas ago in Lech Lecha, and he said to Avraham, know with certainty that your offspring will be strangers in a land not theirs. They will serve them and they will oppress them for 400 years. Well, it says right there, 400 years. How much math do we really need to do? The question really is, when do you start the counting? How do you reckon that period of time? So here's how one 20th century sage engages the question. This from the remarks on the Haggadah by Rabbi Elchanan Bunim Wasserman, Rosh Yeshiva of the Baranovich Yeshiva, who was murdered in the Holocaust. Rav Wasserman brings our attention to a conversation about suffering in the Gemara and Tractate Erech, and it's an interesting conversation that has to do with what is the minimum amount of unpleasantry that could be reckoned as suffering, not the maximum. Maximum amount is a question we'd probably rather not know the answer to, but the minimum. Ad heichen tachlis yisurin, asks the Gemara, how far does the suffering, the definition of suffering, extend? In the view of Rabbi Elazar, kol she'arguloi beged lilbosh, when you order something from a tailor or a dressmaker, ve'ein miskabel alav, and you try it on and it doesn't fit. That is suffering. That's suffering, really. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani says, I can do you one better. Here's a definition of suffering. Afilu niskavnu limzog bechamin umazguloi betzoinen. You ordered a latte, I'm translating freely here, and they handed you an iced coffee, gewalt, or even the other way around. That's suffering. Your whole morning is shot. How about this? Says Mar, the son of Ravina. You know how when nepach lechaluka, when you put your shirt on, but you put it backwards, that's suffering. Starting to remind us of an old Saturday Night Live sketch. I hate when that happens. Rava, or perhaps it's Rav Chizda, says, you know when you put your hand in your pocket or your purse to get some change and you draw out the wrong coins, the wrong amount, that's suffering. The Gemara puts an end to this little exchange, this conversation, by asking, Kol kach lama, what's your point? What do we need to listen to all this for? This can't just be an exercise in absurdity. Because, as they taught in the Rebbe and the yeshiva of Rabbi Yishmael, whoever goes for 40 days without suffering, Kibel alamai, says that person has already received their reward. The Maharsha explains that God sends a person minor irritations, like some of the ones we mentioned, in order to serve as that person's atonement, a little teensy bit at a time. We surely have to pay the piper, but it's not, thankfully, all at once. God's kindness takes our just deserts and spreads them out over a long time, and we experience them drop by drop in measures that we're able to withstand, not at one fell swoop. That's the point of this conversation about minor irritations. They are irritations, but they're minor, and they have a purpose. So back to Rabbi Wasserman, he explains here that the Gemara is talking about minimum sufferings. In other words, the tachlis, the extreme limit, but in this case, the minimum extreme, the small end. What's the minimum that can be considered suffering? And as we saw, they're pretty minor, all things considered. We're well aware of the other end of the spectrum, the fates that may be worse than death, which another Gemara in Ksubas mentions. For example, torture. But the minimum end is also an extreme, and perhaps it's this case that the Haggadah is bringing to our attention. In the passage from Parshas Lech Lecha, chapter 15 of Bereshis that we mentioned earlier, quoting from the Haggadah, quoting from the Chumash, in the covenant between the parts, God lets Avraham know that his descendants will be in exile in a foreign land, and they will be afflicted. Neither of these terms is really defined, though. Perhaps they could be grievous, burdensome, horribly so. On the other hand, perhaps they could be somewhat less than that. The Rosh Yeshiva gives an example of various definitions of exile in Torah law. When a person commits unintentional manslaughter, God forbid, the Torah prescribes a sentence of exile for that person. The person has to go to a city of refuge. That's their atonement. However, if the unintentional perpetrator is a Levite, and he already lives in one of the cities of refuge, what does he do? He just moves to another neighborhood within that city, and through that he can fulfill his sentence. Imagine they give you a choice, jail or Thornhill. What do you choose? Interesting to think about. You'll recall from the last 2 weeks' portions that our descent into Egypt originally was a pleasant trip, even joyous. It was a family reunion, as Yaakov and all the children and grandchildren went to be reunited with Joseph, with Yosef, now the viceroy of Egypt. And then the political climate changed, as it always does, and those who were once welcomed were now despised and enslaved. So when exactly did a visit turn into an exile? When did the suffering begin? And who are the descendants who will undergo affliction? Perhaps it's only the multitudes who eventually left Egypt in the Exodus. Maybe that's the generation that itself had to suffer 400 years. No. Who's the earliest of the descendants? Yitzchak. Isaac was a descendant. He was a child of Avraham. When the parents of a child are exiled, like in Gerar, the child suffers also. So let's count from the birth of Isaac in the year 2048 in the biblical reckoning. Now we count 400 years out from that, 2448, the year of the Exodus. Here we've fulfilled both the promise of exile, the promise of affliction, and the promise of 400 years. However it may have been otherwise reckoned, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Chishev es HaKetz, God calculated the end, the extreme, the absolute minimum that it could have possibly been. That was from the birth of the first descendant in the line. So God considered the absolute bare minimum to have fulfilled the covenant and took us out straight away. We frequently find ourselves saying, may that be the worst. may whatever annoyances or perturbations that we have to experience now be as bad as it gets, nothing worse than this. Truth is, there are probably many things that could be worse, but they aren't, and we may not even be aware of them, which is just as well. As we will read at the very opening of this week's parsha and the new Sefer of Shemos, Ve'ele Shemos b'nei Yisrael habayim Mitzrayma. These are the names of the children of Israel who are coming into Egypt, if you read it literally. Of course, we're talking about historical events, and at the same time, the Torah is talking to us here and now. So, habayim Mitzrayma, the Bnei Yisrael who are coming into Egypt, might signal to us a number of things. Maybe it's suggesting that coming into a new country is a process. It's not just one step when you hop off the plane and you're there. It seems that people who immigrate from one land to another go through a process. It's an ongoing process of arrival. Haba'im Mitzrayma. It may take a while as we hold on to our language, our perspectives, our memories, our feeling of comfort at home, no matter what it was that may have caused us to leave it, and our sense of being strangers in a new land, no matter how long we may have lived there. I'll leave that for you to ponder, those of us who have undergone such a journey in our lives. And of course, all of us are still coming into Mitzrayim. We are all in the continuous process of coming to Egypt, which, as we always say, represents limitation, boundary, and constraints in our lives, whatever many forms that may take, in whatever situation. These past few years were certainly a measure of limitations and constraints. May we soon feel the complete and full liberation from the COVID era. And at the same time, we celebrate our liberation and our ability to be liberated from them once a year, twice at the Sidarim, and of course, when we read these portions at the beginning of Chumash Shemos, which recount the story in all its particulars. And even more than that, every single day of our lives, when we acknowledge and thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we thank God, of whom we say, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, Asher Hoitzeis Yeschem Me'eretz Mitzrayim, God who took us out of Egypt, Liyos Lachem Lelokim, to be our God. That is a process not of minimums, but of maximums every moment of our lives. A good Shabbos.